They are two of my absolute favorite people in all of publishing. When I was a young editor, the young writers that I knew, everyone wanted to write Peter Orner's first book, Esther Stories, and everyone wanted to have their book published by Pat Strachan. So I first see both of them as sort of people that others were aspiring to be. And certainly for me as an editor, Pat has represented sort of the ideal version of what an editor is. We were very, very lucky to publish a story by Peter Orner in the first issue of A Public Space, now 5 years ago, I think. And the memory I have of that story is coming into the magazine the week we were closing the issue. We were in an old converted stable, and at the time we had a giant greenhouse heater that we had to come in and turn on every morning. It was sort of in the dog days of winter. And we'd turn on this heater, and this great blast of wind would sort of go through the office, and the fax machine would be filled with these pages that would sort of start floating out into the air. And they were the proofs that Peter had worked on overnight and made these tiny little edits to his piece. And this would happen every morning. Every morning we'd come in and there'd be a new set of faxes, and at the end of the day we'd send him a new set of proofs. And that care and attention that he pays to every word, every sentence of every book that he's written, I think is what makes him so special as a writer, and so special for an editor to publish him. He is, as I'm sure all of you know, the author of 3 books, Esther Stories, The Last Dance of Humbala, Should Be Coming, thank you, and the new novel, Love and Shame and Love. He is also the author of a series of a column on an online magazine called The Rumpus, The Lonely Voice, is a column of essays about short stories that I recommend to all of you. Pat Strachan is Peter's editor. She has also been the editor of Marilyn Robinson. I think that's the second book that she acquired. John McPhee, Sharifa Rose Pitts, who I see is here in the audience tonight. Grace Paley, the poets Seamus Heaney. Who else am I not thinking of? Paget Powell, Jim Shepherd, Derek Walcott. I wanted to mention the poets that she publishes because I think that the attention, the way she reads those poets is very similar to the way that she edits and reads the fiction writers and the essayists that she's published. She did an interview in Poets and Writers a few years ago where she talked about the different authors that she had edited. She tells a story about working with John McPhee and stories about working with Peter Orner, acquiring his novel. And the word that keeps coming up in every interview with her, in every article about her, is gentleness. And I think today, and in an industry when we often mistake loudness for strength, that Pat's great strength as an editor is her gentleness. I think it allows her to ask the difficult questions of her authors. I think it allows her to read those sentences closely and carefully. And I think it leads to books like Love and Shame and Love. And I think with that, I'm going to get out of the way and let Peter read from his novel, and then let the two of them have their conversation.
Thank you so much, Bridget. I think sometimes people talk about writers, a writer's writer, and I think that having worked with Bridget for a number of years now, I think she's an editor's editor. I think it's just her eye is so careful and so creative. I think that one of the things that I like to talk about as a teacher of literature, I say that I teach writing, but I really don't. I'm trying to teach stories and novels or whatever, but I think close reading is so, we don't do it enough these days. And Bridget is one of the closer readers that you will ever find. So it's really an honor that she came tonight and did this for us. Thank you. And thanks Noreen and Center for Fiction for having me again. And I'm going to read from just the first few pages of his novel. And I'm not going to set it up because it's the first page, so you wouldn't need it, right? It should work for itself. But I'll say that the guy, it's a piece about a judge in Chicago who actually existed. Because in another life, I got a law degree, I know that I can write about real people as long as they're public figures. So I can do this without getting sued. He's also dead, so it's okay. But he was a real guy who I had some association with as a kid. It's called Visit to a Judge. It's Chicago in 1984. This is how it was for certain boys in Chicago, the sons of lawyers. In some families, Alexander Popper's included, forget about the bar mitzvah. To leave boyhood behind, you went to see Judge Abraham Lincoln Merovitz for a chat. Merovitz was a great man, a learned man, bosom buddy of Mayor Daley himself, the machine's favorite judge. In the words of one West Side precinct captain, the Yid really classes up the joint. A federal judge, think, son, of the heights to which you yourself might one day rise. A bachelor, father to no one, and so father to everybody. In the index of Mike Royko's Boss, a great book about Chicago, the judge is listed like this: Merovitz, Abraham Lincoln, pages 41 through 46, and Mafia, page 42. Amateur boxing career, page 41. Association with underworld figures, 42 to 43. Influenced by, quote, friendships, 43 to 44. Friendships with Mayor Richard J. Daley, 45 to 45, 46. Preoccupation with Abraham Lincoln, 41 through 42. Now, to this day, Popper has no truck with Mike Royko's insinuations. He remains a loyal, if wayward, stalwart. And hey, if Judge Merovitz was crooked, he wasn't that crooked, which in Chicago, as everywhere, if everywhere was as honest about being dishonest, means something. It wasn't a chat. Popper remembers how he sat there, swallowed up in that tremendous leather chair, afraid to even move because of how loud the crinkle would sound in his ears, and how he listened. But take a step back. Before he listened, Popper waited. And in that waiting was a silence so absolute it was like drowning in Lake Michigan out past that point where the sandbar gives way to blue emptiness. Him, in there alone, his father in the judge's anteroom pacing, and the judge staring at him. His face and ears and bald pate were ruddy as befitted a man who kept his chambers heartily cold. His single thick eyebrow was like a centipede crawling across the top of his face, and his eyes beneath that thicket of brow were full of motion, and to meet them straight on, as Popper had been ordered by his father to do, caused a churn in his stomach. Above him, as if to enforce the power of the judge's gaze 100-fold, an armada of images of Abraham Lincoln. Paintings, photographs, etchings, silhouettes, drawings. On the tables, busts of Lincoln, statuettes of Lincoln. And they were all watching him too. And this was a test. And the silence was only broken by the judge's sporadic wheezing. 14th floor of the Klaczynski Federal Building, after hours, February. The judge slowly raised one hand and waved it around a little. Then, with the index finger of his other hand, he pointed to a framed picture on his desk of a man and a woman dressed in black. Lined faces, hollow-eyed peasants from Lithuania, his parents. The judge played traffic cop, exhorting him to look around the room and at the same time at the little picture. But he got it. Popper had been prepared by his father to get it. From a Kentucky log cabin to the White House. From the shtetl to the U.S. courthouse. Look at him, look at them. Now look back at me. My father was a peddler. My mother sewed buttons for the landowner's wife. My mother first got wind of the great emancipator at a meeting of socialists in Puerto Breza. She heard that after he freed the slaves, Lincoln got shot in the temple. In the head, Mother. It means in the head. Nothing could convince my mother that Lincoln wasn't a Jew. And the two of them, Popper and the judge, laughed, but the judge stopped laughing earlier, so Popper's laugh hung there alone between them like an insult. And the judge's ruddy face drooped then, became sad. Sad because there were always some boys, who failed to embrace the opportunity that was being handed to them on the silverest of all platters. Maybe you yourself will be one of those boys who squander God's gift of Chicago. One of those boys who will take this gift for granted. The judge talking to him less now than to an audience of ghosts who seemed to have gathered at the darkening windows. Not that any gift worth salt comes without a price. Remember this. But by God, here we are free to live. No Ivan the Terribles, no Cossacks, no Stalins. In this city, they wouldn't know a pogrom from the St. Patrick's Day parade. And here, we answer only to the United States Constitution and Robert's Rules of Order with, note, one unwritten stipulation. Some call it patronage. I call it friendship. Everybody needs somebody else. Just as in the old country, everybody serves Caesar. The difference here is, you get a shot at playing Caesar in the movie. And so does your neighbor, and your neighbor's cousin Babczynski. We scratch each other's back in this city. I scratch you, you scratch me. Nice to have your back scratched, especially those places you can't reach. This is how we build our buildings tallest of the tall, our highways 14 lanes across. Sears Roebuck, Marshall Fields, Weebolts, Goldblatts, Montgomery Ward, Carson Pier, Scott, Hart, Schaffner, and Marx, Polk Brothers, back scratchers all. The judge sneezed then, an eternal, handless sneeze. The sneeze of a man for whom sneezes were not an obstacle to straight dope. His little body jolted. And it wasn't absurd. If it sounds absurd, it is memory's fault and not the judge's. The truth is, it was a show Popper studied for, a show he rehearsed. But there was something fundamental about it that wasn't a show at all. Himself in that big leather chair with his cold feet. It was less the judge's words or all those sorrowful Abraham Lincolns than the incoming dusk of the city, the gray doomful light settling over that room through those half-closed blinds. He was being told in no uncertain terms, don't be cute. Your flesh will wither too. Don't be cowed into the old hoodwink that you are actually young, that you've got your whole life ahead of you. Even cows aren't so stupid. And then the old judge gulped a breath and laughed, really laughed this time. A terrible, high-pitched whinny of a laugh. His eyes disappeared beneath his brow. The skin around his skull seemed to tighten, and all at once, his ruddy face went pale, dead. And that day, Popper too felt dead in that winter office light. Relieved, though, as well, because he'd been prepared for this also. Make it past the laugh, his father had said. All you gotta do is make it past the laugh and you're home free. The judge reached to his shelf and pulled down the Bible, and he began leafing, seemingly at random, until he came to his favorite book, Numbers. And then he intoned. And all the congregation lifted up their voice and cried, and the people wept that night. And all the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron, and the whole congregation said unto them, would that we had died in the land of Egypt. The judge slapped the book shut, leaned towards him over the great desk, and began. How did Moses respond to this cowardice and ingratitude? Well, Your Honor, first he put his head in the sand. And then he pleaded with the people, Your Honor. And then, the people still wouldn't listen, Your Honor. Yes, and then what happened? Well, the Jews prepared to stone Moses and Aaron, Your Honor. Conclusion? Except to be stoned. Except to be stoned for what? The greater glory, Your Honor. Right, true, well done. And then? And then God had enough of the Jews. They were too rebellious, too defiant. He wanted to smite them out of existence, but Moses convinced him to give them another chance. God agreed reluctantly. After a couple of minor plagues for punishment, they got to move on again. Moses wanted to get to the promised land already. 40 years of wandering in the wilderness gets tiring. Sustained, the judge said. And did Moses reach the promised land, Mr. Popper? Popper hesitated purposefully, weighed his answer with the heavy burden of study, of knowledge, of the sad irony of the whole story. No, Your Honor, he never did. In the end, Moses too failed God, and yes, and? Well, God brought him to Mount Nebo and let him have a look at the land of milk and honey, but Moses never set foot in it. In summation, Moses died. Nobody even knows where he's buried. An angry God isn't much of a friend, Your Honor. The skull nodded, and the judge began to clap. With doll-like hands in slow syncopation. Clap, clap, clap. The room all shadows now. Forget about Moses. Goodbye, Abraham Lincoln. You were good stories, good men. But this, my son, is Chicago, and we don't go it alone here. For a long while, they sat together in the new darkness until it was time for the judge to ring the little bell. Tinkle, tinkle. And then, at last, the secretary came in, the light draining into the room as if from another world. And she took Popper by the wrist. He still thinks of her moist grip on his hand, and towed him out to where his proud father waited with his hat in his hands.